just subscribe below, and if you enjoy this, if you find it helpful, please leave a comment and give it a thumbs up.
Dragon's Fire, Part 3. So as you listen to this, you can let your eyes close and you can begin to drift comfortably asleep. And as you drift comfortably asleep, so I'll be just talking in the background. Having just defeated the red dragon and made the village safe from that red dragon, Hyland was aware that this wasn't the end of their mission. This was just the first dragon who was in the valley realm. They now had to take on the dragon in the mountainous realm. And Hyland was aware that to do this, he was going to have to master his body. He'd mastered his mind and intellect, travelling through the valleys, taking on that first dragon, using the mental skills of the elf, Fezler. But now he would have to develop his body, develop his strength, his endurance, and take on the green dragon. So Hyland, Piper, Fezler and Kroger started ascending the mountain. It was a huge mountain range. These mountains towered almost as far as the eye could see up into the sky. And the mountain range wasn't something you could just walk around. It went on way over as far as the eye could see in either direction. And the easiest route up the mountain was to follow the route the water took down the mountain, flowing into the river that passed through the valley and carved the valley all the way out to the sea. And Fezler had no problem bounding up the mountain. He was an excellent climber. He had no problem with managing the terrain at all. Piper, who largely just lived around the sea and on rocks, struggled a bit more with having to have the strength and the effort that you had to put in to climb this mountain. And with his short legs and short arms and short stature and a heavy build, Kroger struggled with climbing in the mountains. And Hyland found it tiring. But was finding it easier than Kroger or Piper. And the rocks they were climbing on were slippery and wet from water splashing onto them. And as they climbed, so it got colder and colder. and the green of the valley turned into brown, with the occasional shrub here and there, and dry grass, and hardy vegetation. And then as they continued to ascend, the hardy vegetation gave way to snow and ice. And they reached a point where the river seemed to go inside the mountain. So they followed the river inside the mountain, followed into the cave. This climbing was hard work and exhausting on the body, and took a lot of mental strength to keep going, to keep climbing, and keep pushing on. They noticed in this cave the cobwebs. Hyland walked ahead with his hand outstretched, with a glowing orb floating just above his hand, using a light magic spell to keep that orb there. And the light from the orb reflected off the walls and made the cobwebs appear to flicker and twinkle, because the cobwebs were covered in a sticky goo. Kroger told everyone to watch out for the cobwebs, try not to touch them. As a dwarf, he spent most of his life living in caves. He was aware of what this was and how dangerous it could be. And after hours and hours and hours of walking, despite trying to be incredibly careful walking through this cave, because they couldn't really see everything clearly, Hyland accidentally stepped on a piece of cobweb, and it was almost like a tripwire. It made a spider aware of their presence. And they didn't at first hear the spider because of the sound of the flowing running water next to them. But then Fezler became aware of a tapping sound. And the tapping sound was getting faster and louder. Then all of a sudden, a giant spider, about 3 times the size of Hyland, burst out in front of them, exposing its fangs with a hiss, and trying to lunge its fangs down into Hyland with his arm outstretched and the glowing orb in his hand. Hyland fired the orb forward at the spider. As all of them leapt out the way of the path and rolled on the ground and hid around a corner, Hyland fired an electric bolt from his left hand, striking the spider, which toppled on its side, but quickly righted itself again. The shiny black spider body reflected the light of the orb that was now just lying there on the floor. The orb was gradually getting dimmer without being fed with the magic from Hyland. Kroger ducked down, ran around behind the group, climbed up on some rocks, and leapt at the spider's jaws, grabbing hold of the spider's teeth, one tooth in each hand, stretching and wrenching on the spider's teeth, pulling them in opposite directions. And the spider was flexing its teeth, the spider was shaking its head and stamping its front legs up and down. And Kroger's face was grimacing and sweat was on his brow as he was using all his strength to try and wrench those teeth further apart. Until with a tearing sound, both teeth ripped out of the spider's mouth, and Kroger fell to the floor holding two venomous teeth in his hands. He threw the teeth aside and leapt back onto the spider, which by now was highly distressed and angry. Venom was dripping from the spider's open gums. And on the back of the spider, Kroger drew his sword high above his head, plunged it deep into the spider's head. And straight away the spider went quiet. Its legs just gave way and it collapsed to the ground. And Kroger, on striking the ground, just rolled off the spider, landing on his feet. He put his sword back in its sheath, and the others came out to take a closer look at what Kroger had done. Hyland then created the orb again above his hand, and they carried on their journey. They were unsure whether there were going to be any other spiders, and they wanted to find a way out of the caves. Eventually they found a way out of the caves, following the water and found a huge waterfall. So they followed Fezler up the side of the waterfall as he guided them where to reach, how to climb the side of this waterfall. They reached the top, and at the top was a vast lake of water, largely ice covered, with the water coming from under the ice and flowing down that waterfall, eventually heading down to create the river down in the valley. And around the side of the lake they could see giant woolly mammoth that would stomp on parts of the lake, breaking the ice so that they could drink. And then kicking at the snow, keeping parts of the snow low so that some of the hardy vegetation was able to survive, and they're able to eat that vegetation. And everything was a blinding bright white, with a freezing, bitterly cold wind howling across the surface of the mountains. And they trudged through the snow, pushing forward. And they saw something in the distance. It looked like a person, but with all the snow and the wind, it was really hard to make it out. They kept walking towards that person. And they kept low, and they tried not to disturb the person. They didn't know who or what it was, but they had to go in this direction. And they saw that it wasn't a person, it was a yeti. But by the time they recognized that, it had smelt them. And there's so little food up here other than the mammoths that a carnivore like this yeti would take on anything to have a meal. So the yeti turned on the group and started charging at them. Hyland took on the yeti. The yeti swung one of its arms to grab at Hyland. Hyland managed to block the arm and add a bit of extra magical strength. And some magic to root himself in place, like an immovable object. And the yeti was built solid. It's like dealing with a wall of muscle. And the yeti was about 3 times larger than Hyland. It swung its other arm at Hyland. He blocked this as well. Then he jumped and kicked hard up between the Yeti's legs, knowing that normally brings down anyone or anything, and the Yeti dropped to its knees. He then created a magic shield and swung this at the Yeti's head, whacking the Yeti round the head, and the Yeti slumped to the ground. But it slumped to the ground more just by shock and being unprepared than by actually being injured. So it very quickly leapt up and took some further swings at Hyland, all of which he managed to dodge, jump, or roll over or under. Yetis would occasionally try and take on mammoths, but mammoths were vastly too big for them to be successful in taking on. While Hyland fought against the Yeti, the others made their getaway, heading in the direction they're all going to be going. Hyland said he'll catch up shortly, and he seemed to have everything under control. The Yeti managed to get a hold on Hyland, and he threw him, and Hyland landed face deep in the snow. Had it been on any other surface, he would have got seriously hurt. But in the snow, he just sunk in head first, and it broke his fall. And because he'd been thrown so far, he had a few seconds before the Yeti reached him again to start working on another spell. And so he gave an incantation, and just as the Yeti was about to thump on his head with both fists connected, almost like gorillas sometimes pound on things, he fired with both hands a bolt of energy out at the Yeti, pushing the Yeti way off in the direction of the mammoths. The Yeti flew off hundreds and hundreds of meters before skidding back through the snow. The Yeti appeared dazed and shaken. This gave Hyland enough time to run and catch up with the others. He joined with the others and carried on until he saw what looked like some kind of old temple up here in the mountains. Looking down from the mountains on one side, they could see the cloud tops, and beneath the clouds they could notice the valley that they'd come up from. Looking down on the other side, they could see a desert. And up here, precariously at the top of the mountains, there seemed to be a stone structure. That seemed to have a temple, that seemed to have been built to worship something. And they heard a roar coming from the temple. They'd obviously disturbed the dragon here. And all of a sudden this green dragon exploded out from under the snow, exploded through the stone floor, sending boulders hurtling into the air, narrowly missing them all. and this dragon was covered in armour, as if something had fitted it out with armour. There was no way that they were going to be able to just somehow get on its neck and strike the vulnerable point in its neck. Hyland realised that him and Kroger were going to have to try and use some strength to wrench this armour off the dragon. But that means getting onto the dragon. So they climbed high up in the structures and goaded the dragon towards them, as the dragon dive-bombed them, breathing fire and flying straight towards them. They leapt through the air, landing on the back of the dragon. They couldn't actually stab or injure the dragon itself, but they both started attacking the armour the dragon was wearing, attacking the joints in the armour, as the dragon flew erratically and at high speed, flying up really high into the air, before diving down really low, spinning off just before hitting the ground, twisting, doing loop-loop. And they just had to hang on, and every time they got an opportunity, they would stab at the armour, hack at the armour. And after much hacking, they managed to break some of the armour free. They still couldn't obviously penetrate the skin of the dragon. There was only one weak spot, and they hadn't yet been able to remove the armour from that spot. So Kroger held hold of Hyland's legs, while he hooked his legs under the dragon's wings and leant forward. And Hyland hung around the dragon's neck, hacking and hacking away, trying to break the armour, while the dragon flew erratically, breathed fire down, trying to get the other two who were on the ground. It obviously couldn't breathe fire onto Hyland or Kroger, who were hanging on. Eventually they managed to break the armour free, exposing the vulnerable part of the dragon's neck. But in breaking the armour free, Hyland dropped his sword. So all he could do was hang onto the neck, upside down, wrap his legs around the neck. And he started punching, punch after punch at the same spot on the neck, trying to punch his hands through the neck, striking and striking. Then Kroger worked up to the neck. He wrapped his legs around the neck, reached around with his shorter arms, and tried to dig his hands into the neck, trying to pull the skin apart. And between them, with Kroger pulling the skin apart, and Hyland thumping between Kroger's hands, eventually Hyland managed to strike straight through the dragon's neck, straight into the heart of the neck. high speed, the green dragon plummeted from the sky, crashed into the mountain, skidded down the mountain, grinding to a halt in a heap down the mountain. Piper and Fezler came running over to check that Kroger and Hyland were okay. They needed a bit of help to get out from underneath the dragon, but they're okay. They're a bit exhausted, and they knew they now had to climb down the other side of the mountain and head out into the desert to find the blue dragon and defeat the blue dragon. And that to do that, they'll need to develop their spirit. So they started their way down the mountain, down towards the desert, into the desert realm.